Dr. Moor, thank you for your hospitality here in Amsterdam. It's great to have the opportunity to discuss with you your biography on Generaal Spoor. The first question I would like to pose to you is, why this biography? Why did you choose for Generaal Spoor, the army commander in the Netherlands-Indies, as a subject of your book?
Yes, why did I choose for Spoor? Well, it wasn't that difficult actually. Dozens of books have been published on the decolonization, on the period of the Indonesian Revolution, on Dutch policy, both in Indonesia and the Netherlands. And all the main players of the Indonesian Revolution have got their biographies, but there was only one was lacking, a biography of Generaal Spoor. So I decided to take Spoor as the subject of my book. And maybe I may, by means of introduction, say that I'm very grateful that the book is translated in Indonesian. I'm grateful to the publishers, Kamphuis. I'm extremely grateful for the excellent translation by Kusala Subakyo and for the work of Jaap Erklens, who took the responsibility for the final editing of the manuscript. So I hope that my book will have positive reception in Indonesia.
Well, it's indeed a fascinating book. But how would you characterize the leading figure, Simon Spoor, as a person on the one hand and as a general, an officer on the other hand?
Yes, well, I would say it was truly an exceptional man. He was artistic. His whole family consisted of artists. He was gifted with great talent, with a quick mind. He was a vigorous person who had powers of persuasion, both as a man and as a military officer. He was a leader of men. Most of the military who served for him did admire him greatly. He was optimistic, full of energy. Dutch politicians who met him in 1945, just before he was promoted commander of the army, they all praised his energy and his optimism. And he had, well, to say it Obama-like, he had a mentality of yes, we can. And one of the politicians called him, well, maybe he is the new Van Heuts, the general of Knil by the end of the 19th century, who finally conquered and united Indonesia. So I would say Spoor was exceptional, gifted with a quick mind, a sharp intellect, a leader of men, energetic, vigorous, and full of optimism.
What was the perspective that Generaal Spoor had on the outcome of the confrontation with the nationalists? What was his view on the future of the Netherlands-Indies as he saw it?
Yes, well, first of all, I think we should realize, and the Indonesian reader also should realize, that Spoor wanted to preserve or to retain the colony for the Netherlands. He was immensely proud that a small country like the Netherlands did have such a huge colonial empire. He was immensely proud of that. And put on the map, for example, between Sabang and Merauke, if you put that on the European map, you have from Dublin in Ireland to Moscow in Russia. So he was proud that the Netherlands had conquered this colony, that they had governed the colony, that they had economically exploited and developed the colony. So his first aim was to preserve the colony for the Netherlands. Then his second idea, or his second view, was that he did not want to return to old-fashioned colonialism, in the sense that the Dutch are the masters and the Indonesians are the subjects. He wanted a new kind of colonial relationship, more partnership between Indonesians and Dutch. That was his ideal for the future. So he didn't want, second principle, he didn't want the return of old-fashioned colonialism, but a new relation of partnership. Then his third principle was that this new relation of partnership could only be achieved when the leadership, the nationalistic leadership of Indonesia, the Sukarno's, Hatta, Sudirman, that these people were removed, because he didn't believe that an agreement was possible between the Netherlands and Indonesia with this generation of nationalist leaders. So the whole of his policy was directed at to remove Sukarno-Hatta, to defeat and eliminate the Republican Army, and to bring forward a new generation of Indonesian leaders who would be willing to compromise with the Dutch. I think that's, in short, in summa, his view: to retain Indonesia for the Netherlands, to create a new colonial relationship of partnership, and to remove Sukarno, Hatta, Sudirman and the entire nationalist leadership.
It's very clear what you say about his view on the main Indonesian leaders, Sukarno, Hatta. But what was his perspective on the military leadership of the Indonesian revolution? What was his view on the Republican army, but also at the main general Sudirman? Did he respect his opponent as a professional soldier? Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, well, the answer can be short. He did not respect Sudirman and the Republican Army at all. He only felt contempt for the military leadership of the Tentare Nasional Indonesia. They were, in his eyes, absolutely not professionals. They were incompetent. Sudirman he often called kind of a chief robber, best schoolmaster, but not more than that. So he had only contempt for the Indonesian army, for the Indonesian forces, and he never believed they would be able to create a normal professional military organization, or that they would be able to carry out or to execute guerrilla warfare. So he had it wrong in this respect. And for the political leadership of the Indonesians, he did have absolute contempt also. He thought that Sukarno was, well, a kind of a windbag, that Hatta was a crypto-communist. So the available leaders of Indonesian nationalism were not acceptable to Spoor, and they should be removed.
But isn't that remarkable that a man with the reputation, as you described it in your book, as Generaal Spoor, as an intellectual, a fast thinker, strong personality, with an intelligence background, that he held his opponents in such a low esteem? Could you say that he underestimated the force not only of the nationalist movement but also of the main leaders, including the military leaders of the nationalist movement? And if so, isn't that a basic mistake of any military commander, to underestimate his opponent?
Sure, yes, absolutely, you're right. He did absolutely underestimate the power of nationalism, the influence of nationalism upon the population, not just a small upper layer, but the entire population. He didn't see that at all. It is remarkable. I must say, I would not have thought when I was writing on Spoor or thinking about Spoor in the 1930s that he would have made that kind of mistake. But he was entirely mistaken. During the 1930s, before he went to Australia in the Second World War, I gradually see that he got more conservative, that his opinion on Indonesian nationalism became more conservative, really. And it was in the Second World War, when he was in Australia, that after the terrible defeat of the colonial army against the Japanese, that he wanted with all his power to return to the Netherlands-Indies and to establish Dutch authority again. But I think I cannot really explain why he made that grave mistake. It was also a military mistake. That's also remarkable. He was an admirer of Clausewitz and of General von Moltke, another German general. And it was Moltke who always said, however beautiful your plan of attack is, the first day on the battlefield, the whole plan has to be readjusted. That should Spoor have done in a way, but he didn't do so. He should have realized that his all blitz attack on the Indonesian forces, that it should be readjusted because they reverted to a kind of colonial war, and he had no feeling or understanding of that at all. So that is, I think, one of his tragic mistakes.
In his inner circle at the headquarters, weren't there any opposing voices against Spoor, looking at his strategy, how to eradicate the Indonesian rebels as they saw it? Or was everyone in his staff applauding whatever the general said and did?
At first, there was opposition against his views. For example, by General Schilling. Schilling found that Spoor was far too optimistic in his views of how to defeat the insurgents.
And Schilling was an experienced Knill general?
Schilling was an experienced pre-war Knill officer, fought also against the Japanese in 1942, and he was pessimistic about Dutch possibilities to eradicate the insurgents the way Spoor was thinking. So in the beginning, and now we are talking about the end of 45, beginning 46, he opposed, as did several others, to Spoor's far too optimistic views. But after Schilling was promoted to military attaché or something in Japan, there was no further resistance to Spoor's views. And that remained so until the end. What Spoor thought necessary, the rest of his staff would absolutely follow.
And that was due to his personality?
That was due to his strong personality, his power to persuade, his vigorous approach. Nobody dared to counteract that. And in a way, Spoor always towered above all the others in his staff, and they were ready to follow him.
Yeah. But what struck me in particular in your book is his relations with the politicians back home in The Hague. When I understood your book correctly, in the beginning, for many of the major politicians in The Hague, Spoor was the solution for the problem. And at a certain moment, the tide is going to change. Could you explain why he lost the confidence of his political masters?
That confidence was in the beginning, indeed, it was very strong. Spoor's optimistic view on his possibilities to defeat the insurgents was believed by the authorities. And Spoor also was very, influencing or pushing the politicians in his own direction. He was very good at that. He often wrote letters directly to, for example, the Prime Minister or ministers in the cabinet to persuade them of his views. And they were, a long time they were willing to believe that Spoor took the right course. But it began to change after the first so-called police action, because the politicians felt more or less cheated by Spoor. The politicians wanted a limited action, not an attack on Yogyakarta, for example, during the first police action. And Spoor wanted a full attack on Yogyakarta. But because he understood that the politicians would not agree, he said that he would only have a limited action. But he did so thinking that once the limited action was going on, the politicians would see and understand that a full attack on Yogyakarta now was inevitable. And that was, I think, the first moment that politicians began to doubt and began to criticize Spoor. And after the second police action, then we are in 49, he kept on telling the politicians, give me 2 more weeks, give me 3 weeks, and we will have won. And that, nobody believed that any longer in 49. So gradually they took their leave from Spoor and they let him work in Indonesia, planning for the future, but they didn't take him seriously anymore until his death, which came in May 49.
Looking at your subtitle, the Triumph and Tragedy of an Army Commander, what exactly do you mean with triumph and what exactly with tragedy?
Tragedy, ja, Kejayaan dan tragedie. The triumph is his magnificent career. He was promoted Lieutenant General when he was 44, full General when he was 47. In all, he had a magnificent career which really started to become very successful during his stay in Australia during the Second World War. There he demonstrated to be a very good organizer, a vigorous, optimistic organizer. So the triumph is his entire career, which brought him to the top so early. And the tragedy is, I think, that he failed to readjust in the course of the battle with the Indonesian Republicans. And the tragedy is also that he finally ended totally exhausted, immensely disappointed in the course of affairs, immensely disappointed in the ideas of Dutch politicians, how to solve it, and that, well, that's the tragedy, I think.
What is your final assessment of General Spoor?
Well, the conclusion I took in my book is that he failed to readjust. In Dutch, it is de bakens verzetten, to change the beacons, but that's no English, I believe. But he failed to readjust his policy, to readjust his military aims, and he kept on telling the cabinet in The Hague, just give me some more time and we have solved the problem. But it was far from that. So he underestimated nationalism, the nationalism among the Indonesians, and he underestimated the military capabilities of the Indonesians. That's, I think, that's the tragedy.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.